All right, so welcome back. So this is part three in our histology lecture, and we left off in part two talking about epithelial tissues and different types of epithelial tissues, and we looked at some examples of some different images. So in part three here, we're going to look at connective tissue as a broad type of tissue. So connective tissue, based on its name, you can kind of assume that these tissues are going to be involved with connecting or binding adjacent tissues and binding different things throughout the body. All right. Now we have different types of connective tissue, and there's really a wide variety of connective tissue types based on their appearance, based upon their cell type and what type of fibers they have, along with their consistency. So we can have everything from bone, which is very hard, very dense, all the way to something like blood, which is obviously a liquid. Okay, so we'll go through these four different types of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper, we then have cartilage, we have bone, or sometimes called osseous connective tissue, and then we have blood itself. All right, so talking about connective tissues in general. So for all of these types that we're going to look at here, connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood, they're all going to have these same things, these same types here, okay? So they're going to have some type of cell, they're going to have some type of protein fiber, and then they're going to have something called ground substance, okay? Now, we'll also use the term extracellular matrix, and this extracellular matrix is essentially everything that is not the cell. So it's the protein fibers and it's the ground substance kind of combined together, all right? So the cells will have a very distinct function depending on what type of connective tissue we're looking at. So we'll look at bone cells, cartilage cells, blood cells. We'll have different protein fibers that can help bind and provide some strength to our connective tissue. And then the ground substance is kind of what the cells in these fibers are suspended in. And it's the space between these cells and these fibers. All right. So if we look here, we can look at some of the different types of cells and some of the different types of protein fibers. Right. So we have cells, and a lot of these are going to end in site or they're going to end in blast. Okay. So we have osteoblast and osteocyte. And when you're looking at these cells, pay attention to the prefix. Pay attention to the first part of the cell name. All right. So osteoblast, osteocyte. Osteo means bone. So these are the bone cells. Fibroblast, fibrocyte. These are going to be producing cartilage. All right. So this fibro. Chondroblast, chondrocyte. Chondro, this prefix chond or chondro means cartilage. Okay. So these are our cartilage cells. Adipocytes, adipo means adipose tissue. This is referring to fat. So these are our fat cells. And then we have our blood cells. So we have cells of immunity as an example. We have red blood cells. We also have platelets. Okay. So remember, for all these different tissues, in order to be a tissue, you have to have at least two different types of cells working together. And that's what we see with all of these. Now, we also have different types of proteins. We have different types of fibers within these connective tissues. So one of these is collagen. Collagen is going to be very strong. It's going to have tensile strength, so allow things to resist breaking and resist tension. And you can think of a collagen fiber almost as like a kind of weaved like rope type fiber. Okay, they're going to be very strong. So this is what we'll find in our dense connective tissue, dense regular, dense irregular, things like that. We have one called elastin. Elastin, based on its name, you can probably imagine, provides some elasticity to the tissue. So not only can the tissue distend, but it's also elastic and it's able to come back to its original shape. So it allows for recoil. Okay, this allows different tissues to flex and to bend and to be stretched. And so we'll talk about different tissues that are able to do this. And then we have the last one called reticular fiber or reticular protein fibers. These are a type of collagen, really, and they form like a mesh-like network. Okay, so we find these in lots of lymphatic organs, so lymph nodes. You can also find them in things like the liver and things like the spleen as well. Okay, so you'll see kind of these dark fibers that are kind of cross-linked into this mesh-like network. All right, so starting off, we're going to look at dense and loose types of connective tissue. All right. So the first one is loose connective tissue, and this is a type of what is called areolar connective tissue. All right. So you can almost think of areolar as loose. All right. So this type of connective tissue is going to be very cellular. Okay, meaning that you're going to see lots of cells in it. Now, some connective tissues are not very cellular. You see lots of ground substance, you see lots of protein fibers and not as many cells. But for loose, you're going to see lots of different cells. Okay. You can have this surrounding different organs. You can have it surrounding blood vessels. And this is largely a binding tissue, meaning that it's going to help join and bind adjacent tissues together. So if you were to look in your arm, if you could peel back your skin, if you could peel back your muscle, and you looked at your tendons and you looked at your nerves and you looked at your blood vessels, these are not just free floating, dangling within your body, within your arm or your leg or somewhere, but they're bound to adjacent tissue. So they're connected to each other. They're bound to fat. They're bound to the muscle. And this helps kind of keep them in place. All right. So when you look at it histologically, you see this almost kind of like, I like to think of pickup sticks. If you ever played pickup sticks growing up, you knew that you have a bunch of wooden sticks and you drop them and they kind of form these kind of cross links, one laying on top of another. That's kind of what I like to think of loose or areolar connective tissue looking like. Okay, so you have these pink, if you look at the image on the right, you have these pink fibers, and these pink fibers are these large collagen fibers. All right, and so these collagen fibers run kind of crosswise, cross each other, and this helps to provide some structure to this type of connective tissue. You can also see little dots, little kind of purple-black dots scattered throughout the tissue, and these are the nuclei, the nucleus of the fibroblast. So fibroblasts are one of the types of cells that we looked at in the previous slide. Okay. So when you look at areolar connective tissue, you can find it between muscles. So between our muscles, we have membranes, or the septa that divide different muscles and divide different compartments of muscles, and this can be made of loose connective tissue. It's going to surround our organs, bind skin to underlying organs, and it's really found throughout the body. But keep in mind, we have fibroblasts, we have collagen fibers, and then the thin, dark fibers, if we look here, these thin ones that you see, these are elastic fibers. So this allows the tissue to have somewhat it has some distensibility to it. It's able to stretch, but it's also able to recoil back to its original shape. All right. Okay, so the second type of connective tissue that we'll look at is adipose tissue. So adipose tissue is another type of loose connective tissue, and this is what's just generally referred to as fat, right? And so this is an example of where you see a very distinct appearance to the tissue. So some tissues are harder to differentiate than others. Adipose tissue is usually a very easy one to identify. Okay, so it has this large central region. When you look at it histologically in these images down to the bottom and this one on the right, it looks almost empty. It looks like this circular space. All right, that is the cell itself, and that space that you see in the middle, that white space, that's called the fat vacuole. Okay, and that fat vacuole is what contains the droplet of fat, the lipid droplet that'll occupy that space. Also, if you look closely at this upper right image, you can see little black dots. Those are the nuclei that are pushed off to the side. That is the nucleus of the adipocyte. And the reason it's pushed off to the side is because instead of being in the middle, maybe like other cell types, when the lipid droplet is in the middle, it pushes all of the organelles, all the cytoplasm, and the nucleus, pushes it off to the side of the plasma membrane. So you'll see those little dots, which are the nuclei, you'll see them pushed to the very side of the cell, all right? And we know that fat can have a number of different functions, right? It can protect us, so it surrounds different organs. It's found underneath our skin. It can provide insulation, so for keeping us warm. It can also serve as an energy storage, right? So we can pull on our triglycerides and break triglycerides down into fatty acids, and then use fatty acids to ultimately make ATP, so to make energy, right? So it has a number of different functions, okay? So when I did my cadaver dissection, and we were looking at our cadaver, and we opened up her chest cavity, and we opened up the pericardial sac, and we went in to look at the heart. Her heart, our cadaver's heart, the entire surface of the heart was yellow. It was completely covered with adipose tissue, okay? It has a very distinct look to it, all right? We also had some cadavers that were very thick, that they had very thick skin. They had lots of adipose tissue underneath their skin, so it took a lot more effort to cut through the skin. We had other cadavers that were extremely thin, where they had almost no adipose tissue underneath their skin. Okay, so this is a type of tissue. It's going to vary depending on person. All right. So we also have reticular connective tissue. All right, this is the third type of loose connective tissue here. This forms a kind of mesh-like network that helps to support the organ or the structure that it is located in. Okay, so sometimes it's described as looking like a cherry tree. So if you look here, you see these nuclei, you see the cells of the nucleus of these different cells, and then you see these reticular fibers, and it looks like cherries on a cherry tree. If you can imagine that, that's kind of something that it looks like, right? And so reticular fibers in this reticular connective tissue serve to support and provide a structural network for the organ that it's associated with, right? And we find this largely in the spleen. So that organ in your left upper quadrant, you have the spleen there, filters blood. We have it in our lymph nodes that are scattered throughout our body, right? So when you go to the doctor and they feel your neck and they are feeling your lymph nodes, this is made up of reticular connective tissue. And then in the bone marrow as well, you have reticular connective tissue here, okay? All right, so those are different types of loose connective tissue, all right? So now we'll get into dense. And dense comes in two different types, okay, two different flavors. There's dense regular, and if there's dense regular, there's also a dense irregular, okay? And we'll talk about how to identify dense regular versus dense irregular. So starting off with dense regular. Dense regular, the way you identify dense regular is you look at the orientation of the collagen fibers, okay? So the fibers in this case, remember we said all connective tissues are made up of cells, they're made up of fibers, and they're made up of the ground substance. The fibers in this case are collagen fibers, okay, which are made by the fibroblast, all right? So the collagen fibers in this dense regular connective tissue are all oriented parallel to one another. So in other words, they're all running more or less in the same direction, okay? And then scattered throughout and kind of between, you have the fibroblasts. So all of these little dots that you see here in the schematic and what you see in this histological image, those little purple black dots, those are the nuclei of those fibroblasts that are kind of squeezed and forced in between the adjacent collagen fibers, okay? Because the collagen fibers are oriented in one direction, because they're going in a single plane, right? They're all going vertically, they're all going horizontally, they're going to provide support and strength in just that one plane, okay? So if they're running up and down, they're going to provide support in the vertical plane. If they're running horizontally, they're going to provide it in that side-to-side horizontal plane, all right? So if you feel on the back of your leg, if you go down to your, around where your ankle is, on the backside, you should feel that very large tendon that we generally refer to as the Achilles tendon, right? This is called the calcaneal tendon, okay? That's its anatomical name. So the calcaneal tendon is a type, what it's made of, it is made of dense regular connective tissue, all right? So imagine you can kind of trace your fingers from your ankle, from your heel up kind of behind your ankle, and then kind of up the backside of your leg, and you can follow that Achilles tendon or this calcaneal tendon up the leg, or you can follow it down. And you notice that it's running just in that one plane. It's running in this vertical plane, so it is providing support and resistance to stress in just that one plane, okay? So when you contract your calf, it pulls the calcaneal tendon, causes you to point your toes down, so to plantar flex. When you relax and then you contract the anterior leg muscles, it stretches it and it allows your toes to point up when you dorsiflex, right? And we'll talk about those in future lectures. But things like tendons, things like ligaments, so all of those tendons that you see running in your wrist that run into your palm and out to your fingers that allow you to flex and extend your fingers, your digits, these are all made up of dense regular connective tissues, okay, with collagen fibers and these cells that are called fibroblasts, okay? When you see the term blast on the end of a cell, think that it is building that cell, or it is building something, it is producing something, okay? So when we do our bone lecture, we'll talk about osteoblast. These are the cells that build bone. Chondroblast are the cells that build cartilage, okay? So keep this in mind. All right. No, so if we know that dense regular, all the collagen fibers are oriented in a single plane, right, parallel to one another, then dense irregular is probably the exact opposite of that. So instead of in one single parallel plane, they're all arranged in a non-parallel fashion. So in other words, they're irregularly arranged, okay? So some may be going vertically, some may be going horizontally, some may be running diagonally or obliquely. They're running in all different directions, okay? So instead of providing support and strength in one direction, now we have a tissue that is providing it in multiple directions, okay? Because of the multiple orientations of these collagen fibers, okay? They're still made by the fibroblast, so you'll still find fibroblasts embedded within this tissue, okay? So you can find this in the dermis of your skin. So the dermis of your skin is just deep to the epidermis. So epi means on top, so the epidermis is on top of the dermis. And we'll look at this when we do our skin lecture. And also around joint capsules. So the joint capsules around our hip, the joint capsules around our shoulder, for example. These are providing support and resisting tension in multiple directions. So if you think about the capsule that surrounds your shoulder, you move your shoulder in all different directions. You move it up and down, you move it forward and backwards, you move it diagonally, you move it in a circle, right? All these different directions. So we need a tissue type that is going to be able to withstand the tension and withstand the stresses and the stressors that come with being able to move that joint in multiple different directions, right? So when you look at it, I always like to think that this tissue looks marbled in appearance. So if you look at this image up at the top, I like to think it looks very marbled. It kind of has this world appearance to it, okay? All right, we also have elastic connective tissues, okay? So we'll talk about something in a little bit called elastic cartilage, which is different than elastic connective tissue here. So elastic connective tissue, hence its name, is going to contain lots and lots of elastic fibers, okay? And these are called elastin fibers, all right? You also have fibroblasts, and these are going to be found in tissues that we need a certain degree of stretch and distension, but we also want that structure to return to its original shape, okay? So think of something like large blood vessels. So the large blood vessel coming off the base of your heart is called the aorta, and it is under an extreme amount of pressure during ventricular contraction. So when the ventricles contract, they force blood out of the heart, out of the ventricles, and into the aorta, and the blood pressure is really high, and it stretches and it distends that aorta. The reason it's able to be stretched and distended is because of the large quantity of elastin fibers that you find in this area of the aorta. Smaller blood vessels further away from the heart, you're likely to find fewer elastin fibers because they're not as strained, they're not under as much pressure. Okay. We also find these in the bronchial tube. So think about as we're inhaling and as we're needing to increase the diameter of our airway in order to bring in more air, we can have elastin fibers with this elastic connective tissue help for this, okay? So it's allowing for stretch, but it's also allowing for recoil to return to shape. So in a histological specimen, when you look at a tissue, usually the elastin fibers are very dark, they're darkly stained, and they usually appear very convoluted and very twisted. Okay, so if you look in this image here, you can see lots of dark fibers, and you notice that they're very convoluted, they're very wrinkled, and you can imagine how when they're wrinkled like this, they then have the ability to stretch out, and this allows the tissue to be able to be distended. All right, so those are our kind of connective tissue propers. All right, so we had loose, we had dense, we have these. We have the reticular, we have elastic, we have all these different ones, all right? Now, we also have these supporting connective tissues, okay? So we have things like cartilage, we have things like bone, we have things like blood, all right? So when we look at bone and when we look at cartilage, all right? So we'll look at these next. Bone and cartilage are going to have different features. They don't look the same, but they do have some things that are similar, all right? One of the things that is similar is a structure called a lacunae, okay? And a lacunae you can think of as this space that houses the cell for that particular tissue type. So there is a lacunae that houses the cell for bones called an osteocyte. There's also a lacunae or this space that houses the cell for cartilage, which is called a chondrocyte, okay? So if you look at the bottom here, you can see all this matrix, this extracellular matrix out here, a lacunae, which is the space, and then on the inside of the lacunae, this purple structure, that is the cell. Okay, so that is the chondrocyte in this case because we're looking at cartilage. All right. The chondrocytes for cartilage, these are in the lacunae, and the lacunae is embedded within this extracellular matrix. Okay, and we said the extracellular matrix earlier is essentially just the ground substance plus the protein fibers kind of all put together. All right. If you look at the image to the right, you can see an actual histological image of a lacunae, and then on the inside of the lacunae, you would expect to find the cell itself. Okay. Now, another important thing about cartilage here is that cartilage is avascular. Okay, so vascular meaning blood vessels, and a meaning not or without. So it is without blood vessels. So it does not receive a blood supply. So it receives its nutrients, it receives its gases, and gets rid of waste products through the process of diffusion. So when we look at our different cartilage types, we have three different types. So we have hyaline cartilage, we have ones called fibrocartilage, and we have one called elastic cartilage. All right, so we'll look at hyaline cartilage first. Hyaline cartilage is a very common type of cartilage. We find it kind of throughout the body in different areas, and we also have it during our development. And there are certain areas where we actually lose hyaline cartilage as we develop, but we'll talk about this. So hyaline cartilage is a very firm, but it's also flexible type of connective tissue. Okay, you have lots of lacunae, and these lacunae, as we said in the previous slide, are filled with chondrocytes. Okay, these are evenly dispersed, and the background kind of is very clear. It does not look very rough, and so sometimes it's referred to as having a glassy appearance to it. Okay, but sometimes the lacunae and the chondrocytes can kind of aggregate, and they can kind of stick together, if you will. Okay, so if you look here in the schematic here, you see that multiple lacunae with multiple chondrocytes here, all kind of all throughout, have stuck together and kind of joined together. And then here in an actual histological image, you can see something that looks very similar to that. Okay, so we find hyaline cartilage throughout the body. The tip of your nose, right? So if you touch your nose, that point of your nose, right next to your nostrils here, this is not bone, but it's cartilage, right? So you can move this around relatively easily. If you go down and you feel your trachea and you feel your thyroid cartilage, this is all hyaline cartilage. So all of those tracheal rings, those kind of rivets and those bumps that you feel in your cervical region, these are all types of hyaline cartilage. When you feel your sternum, and then you go just lateral and you feel what kind of we think of as our ribs, right there, most close to the sternum, that's actually hyaline cartilage. Okay, it's called costal cartilage, but the type of cartilage that it is hyaline cartilage. Right. We also have hyaline cartilage make up our embryonic skeleton. Okay, so during embryological and fetal development, we actually don't start off with bone. We start off with a type of connective tissue, and then for some of our bones, we transform that connective tissue into cartilage, and we're born with this. Not we're born with it, but we have it during development, this cartilage template of our skeleton, and then we progressively replace that cartilage with bone in a process called ossification. And we'll talk about endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification in future lectures. Okay, and then we also have it on the end of long bones. Okay, so we have it at the end of long bones really in two regions. We have it as one region called the epiphyseal plate, which allows our bones to grow in length. And then we also have it as some articular cartilage at the end of bones where two bones come together and meet each other. All right. So we also have fibrocartilage. So that was hyaline cartilage. Fibrocartilage, hence its name, is fibrous. Okay, it's going to contain lots and lots of collagen fibers. And this means that this cartilage type is going to be more capable or more able to withstand compression and withstand large weight-bearing forces. Okay, so usually when you look at this type of tissue histologically, you can see the collagen fibers much more easily than you could with hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage, we said it kind of looked clear and kind of glassy. With fibrocartilage, you can usually see it much easier. Okay, so if you look at the image at the bottom, this blue, all of these blue strands, these are all examples of collagen fibers. And then you see the same thing up here in this top left image. Here, they're a little bit more of a kind of a turquoise green color, but it's the same thing. You can make out the collagen fibers a little bit more easily. Okay, so because of this idea that the fibrocartilage is fibrous and it's firm and it allows for shock absorption and compression, you can think of where you may find it. So one area is the intervertebral discs. So where we have our vertebrae. In between our vertebrae, we have a pad of cartilage, right? So sometimes we just refer this to as a disc, right? If you have a slipped disc or a herniated disc, this is the fibrocartilage here, all right? So whenever we're walking and we're jumping and we're running and we're doing different physical activities, our spine and our vertebral column is needing to bear that weight. And one of the ways that we're able to bear that weight and absorb some of that shock and absorb some of that compression is through this fibrocartilage we have here. Okay, we also have fibrocartilage in between our two pubic bones at a region called the pubic symphysis. Sometimes it's referred to as the symphysis pubis. So this is this image down here to the right, and you can see, so here's one pubic bone, here's another pubic bone, and right in the middle we have this little pad of fibrocartilage called the pubic symphysis. Okay, so this is resisting compression. It is absorbing compressive shock in an attempt to help us bear this stress and bear this weight a little bit easier. Okay, and then the last type of cartilage we have is elastic cartilage. All right, so elastic cartilage you can kind of think of as similar to the elastic connective tissue we talked about previously, in that it's going to contain lots of those elastin fibers. Okay, usually, now you don't always go off the color when you're looking at histology, but usually elastic tissue is stained dark. Okay, because elastic tissues, the staining technique that is often used stains the elastic tissues a very dark, kind of dark blue or black color. All right, this connective tissue, elastic cartilage, also has very large lacunae. Okay, so remember, lacunae are what contain our cells, our chondrocytes, and in elastic connective tissue and elastic cartilage, they're very, very large. Okay, they have very large lacunae with the chondrocytes within them. So you can see here in all three of these images, very large lacunae, and in the top two, you can see that these are staining a relatively dark color. All right. So in terms of the location for elastic cartilage, it's very easy to remember because elastic cartilage starts with an E, and the locations you can expect to find it also start with an E. So we're going to have the ear, we're going to have the eustachian tube, and we're going to have the epiglottis. Okay. So the ear, specifically referring to the outer ear, our auricle or our pinna. So the ear, the part of the ear that you can actually see and touch, right? We have our eustachian tube. Our eustachian tube is a passageway connecting the middle ear cavity to what's called the nasopharynx, which is essentially if you open up your mouth and you go straight to the back of your throat and then you go up, this is the nasopharynx. If you've ever been eating something or drinking something and someone makes you laugh or you cough and that food or drink shoots out of your nose, right? That food went up from your oral cavity into your oral pharynx, up to your nasopharynx, and then it comes out your nose, right? It also, if you've ever seen people on the internet who can they can like inhale a piece of spaghetti or something or a string through their nose and then it comes out their mouth and they can move it between the two. They're utilizing this space called the nasopharynx. Okay, and then we have it in the epiglottis. So the epiglottis is a flap of elastic cartilage that closes off the larynx as we are in the process of swallowing to prevent food, to prevent liquid, or anything else that we ingest from going into the larynx and the trachea and into our lungs when it really needs to be going into the esophagus and then into the stomach. Okay. All right. So we're going to stop here and we'll pick up with our next part talking about bone or osseous connective tissue and then finishing up connective tissue by talking about blood.